Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
My score changed overnight. What if one tiny mistake you've completely forgotten is quietly deciding your future today? That question hit me harder than I ever expected because one ordinary Tuesday morning in the United States, I opened my banking app expecting to see nothing unusual. Instead, I saw a number that made my heart stop. My credit score had changed overnight. No warning. No dramatic phone call. Just one number that suddenly made me question my habits, my confidence, and even the kind of example I was setting for my family. I thought this story was about money. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was about responsibility, and the lesson changed my life forever. My name is Emily, and I live a peaceful life with my husband and our children in a quiet American neighborhood. Most mornings begin the same way. I make coffee, prepare breakfast, remind the kids about school, and enjoy a few peaceful minutes before the day becomes busy. Nothing about that Tuesday felt different. Birds were singing outside the kitchen window. My husband had already left for work. The house was unusually quiet. I picked up my phone, opened my banking app, and almost dropped it. I stared at the screen. I refreshed it. Then I checked again. The number was still there. For several seconds, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. My credit score had dropped. Not dramatically, but enough to make me feel an uncomfortable knot in my stomach. My first thought wasn't about money. It was much more personal. What did I do wrong? I replayed the past few weeks in my mind. We hadn't made any expensive purchases. We always stayed within our family budget. We avoided unnecessary spending. Everything seemed normal. Yet that small number suggested something different. That morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even while shopping for groceries, my mind stayed busy. The cashier smiled warmly and asked, "How are you today?" I answered automatically. "I'm doing well, thank you." As I walked toward the parking lot, I quietly repeated the sentence to myself. Practicing simple English conversations had become part of my daily routine. Normally it made me smile. Today, however, my thoughts kept returning to one question. What had happened? When my husband came home that evening, he immediately noticed something was wrong. "You've been quiet all day," he said. I handed him my phone without saying a word. He looked at the screen, nodded calmly, and then surprised me with his reaction. He didn't panic. He didn't blame me. He didn't even seem shocked. Instead, he smiled gently. I think this might become one of the best lessons we've ever learned. I looked at him in complete confusion. The best lesson? I asked. My score just dropped. He nodded again. I know. Shouldn't we be worried? We should be curious. That answer completely caught me off guard. Curious? How could anyone be curious when something important had suddenly gone in the wrong direction? After dinner, while the children finished their homework upstairs, we sat together at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea. My husband didn't open a financial website right away. Instead, he took out a blank piece of paper and drew a simple circle. Inside the circle, he wrote one word. Responsibility. Then he looked at me and quietly asked, "Emily, what if your credit score isn't really measuring your money? What if it's measuring something much deeper?" I had never heard anyone describe it that way before. For the first time, I realized I had spent years paying attention to the number while completely ignoring the habit behind it. That single thought made me feel both nervous and strangely hopeful. Somewhere inside that ordinary credit report was a lesson I had never expected to learn. As my husband slowly opened the detailed report on his laptop, his expression changed. He pointed to one small line buried among dozens of ordinary entries. "Here," he whispered. I leaned closer to the screen. One tiny detail from several weeks earlier had quietly changed everything, and when I finally understood what it meant, I realized my biggest mistake had never been financial at all. The conversation I couldn't forget. The tiny detail hiding inside my credit report wasn't a huge debt, identity theft, or a banking error. It was something so small that I almost laughed when I first saw it. Then I realized that one overlooked detail had quietly revealed a much bigger truth about my life. My husband looked at me and said, "Emily, your credit score didn't teach you about money today. It taught you about responsibility." That single sentence stayed with me long after the laptop was closed, and I had no idea it was about to change the way I viewed marriage, family, and even myself. I leaned closer to the screen while my husband pointed to a payment that had arrived later than expected. It wasn't weeks late. It wasn't a disaster. It was simply enough to be noticed by the system. I felt embarrassed immediately. "I can't believe something this small mattered," I whispered. My husband smiled kindly. "In America," he said, "small habits often matter more than big promises." That answer surprised me. I had always imagined responsibility as something dramatic, making huge sacrifices, solving difficult problems, or facing major life decisions. But according to him, responsibility looked much quieter. It looked like paying attention, keeping promises, finishing what you started, showing consistency, even when nobody was watching. He reached for a notebook lying on the kitchen counter. "Think about our garden," he said. I laughed. "Our tomatoes?" He nodded. "We don't water them once a month with a giant bucket. We water them a little almost every day." I smiled because I already understood where he was going. Responsibility works the same way. That simple comparison made everything clearer than any financial article I had ever read. The next morning, while driving to the grocery store, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Every traffic light seemed to remind me that life isn't usually changed by one enormous event. It's changed by hundreds of tiny choices that quietly accumulate over time. Inside the store, I picked up fresh vegetables, milk, bread, and fruit. At the checkout counter, the cashier greeted me with a friendly smile. "Did you find everything you needed today?" "Yes, thank you," I answered naturally. As I walked toward my car, I repeated the sentence softly to myself. I loved collecting simple English expressions from everyday conversations. They were easy to remember because each one belonged to a real moment instead of a classroom exercise. Without realizing it, responsibility was helping my English too. Showing up every day, even for a few minutes, was making me a better listener and speaker. That evening, my husband suggested something unexpected. Let's stop talking about credit scores for a moment. I looked at him curiously. Why? Because the score isn't the real story. He handed me a blank sheet of paper. Write down 5 responsibilities you already handle well. At first, I struggled. Then I wrote. Preparing breakfast for the children. Keeping our family calendar organized. Calling my parents every weekend. Practicing English every day. Supporting my husband when work becomes stressful. He smiled. You see? What? You're already a responsible person. I looked at the list again. So why did I feel like I failed? Because one mistake became louder than 100 good habits. His answer hit me deeply. Psychologists often explain that our brains naturally pay more attention to negative events than positive ones. One mistake can feel much larger than dozens of successes. Suddenly, I understood why I had spent an entire day worrying about one small change in my credit score while completely forgetting everything our family had done right. I thought I had learned the lesson. Then my husband quietly opened another page on the laptop. This, he said, is something most people never notice. It wasn't another number. It wasn't another payment. It was a timeline showing how everyday habits slowly build trust over months and years. As I watched those tiny changes forming a much bigger picture, I realized something that sent chills down my spine. My credit score wasn't quietly judging my past. It was quietly predicting the future I was building one ordinary day at a time, and what I discovered on the next page completely changed the way I looked at every decision I made afterward. Responsibility starts with small choices. The page my husband showed me didn't predict how much money we would earn. It didn't promise success or warn about failure. Instead, it revealed something far more surprising. Every small decision we made was quietly creating a pattern, and that pattern was becoming our reputation long before anyone met us. I had always believed responsibility appeared during life's biggest moments. That night, I discovered it was actually being built on completely ordinary Tuesdays, ordinary grocery trips, and ordinary promises that almost nobody notices. Once I understood that, I could never look at daily life the same way again. I stared at the timeline on the laptop. Tiny dots stretched across the screen. Each dot represented a payment, a decision, a habit, or a simple action completed on time. Looking at it felt strangely emotional. None of those moments seemed important when they happened. Together, however, they told the story of our family's consistency. My husband quietly closed the laptop. Emily, he asked, what do you think responsibility looks like? I thought for a moment. Doing the right thing. He smiled. Yes. But even more importantly, doing the right thing when nobody is watching. Those words stayed with me. The following morning, I decided to perform a little experiment. Instead of searching for one big way to become more responsible, I focused on tiny actions. I made the bed before checking my phone. I answered an email I had been postponing. I organized our family calendar for the week. I reviewed our grocery budget before leaving the house. None of these tasks were exciting. Yet finishing them gave me an unexpected sense of peace. While shopping that afternoon, I noticed another small opportunity to practice English naturally. The cashier smiled and asked, "Paper or plastic?" "Paper, please," I answered with confidence. Then she added, "Have a wonderful day." "You too." "Thank you." Those simple conversations no longer felt stressful. I realized that learning English worked exactly like building responsibility. 5 minutes every day was more powerful than 2 hours once a month. Progress wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. That evening, I read an interesting article explaining that psychologists often describe habits as automatic decisions created through repetition. Research suggests that when small routines become consistent, the brain spends less energy deciding what to do, making positive behavior easier to repeat. Suddenly, everything connected perfectly. Responsibility wasn't about having extraordinary discipline every day. It was about creating ordinary routines that made good decisions almost automatic. I shared the article with my husband. He laughed softly. "So responsibility isn't magic?" "No. It's architecture." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "We build today's habits. And tomorrow's habits begin living inside them." I smiled because the comparison was beautiful. A few days later, something happened that quietly tested my new mindset. I received an email reminding me about a payment due the following week. The old version of me would have thought, "I'll do it later." Instead, I stopped what I was doing and scheduled it immediately. The entire task took less than 2 minutes. As silly as it sounds, I felt proud. Not because I had paid a bill. Because I had interrupted an old habit before it could return. Little victories deserve celebration too. That weekend, while cleaning the garage with my husband, we found an old notebook filled with family goals we had written months earlier. Some were completed. Others still needed work. But something caught my attention. Almost every goal had one thing in common. None depended on luck. They all depended on responsibility. Saving consistently. Spending wisely. Making time for family dinners. Practicing English every day. Keeping promises. The list looked surprisingly simple. Yet I suddenly understood why so many people never reach their goals. Most people wait for motivation. Responsible people create routines. I thought that realization would be the biggest lesson of the month. Then, just as we closed the notebook, my phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. But after reading the message twice, my smile disappeared. One unexpected reminder revealed that my biggest test of responsibility wasn't behind me. It was about to begin. My first real financial mistake. The notification on my phone looked so ordinary that most people would have ignored it. I almost did. But one tap changed everything. It wasn't a warning that my account had been hacked. It wasn't a giant bill. It was something much more dangerous because it seemed completely harmless. That day, I discovered that the biggest mistakes in life rarely arrive shouting. They usually whisper. And if you're not paying attention, those whispers slowly become consequences. I thought I had finally become responsible. Life was about to show me that responsibility isn't something you achieve once. It's something you practice every single day. The message came from my banking app while my husband and I were cleaning the garage. Your statement is now available. I smiled. No problem, I thought. I'll check it tonight. That sentence sounded perfectly reasonable. The problem was that I said the same thing the next morning. And again the following evening. Life became unusually busy. One child had a school project. Another needed a ride to soccer practice. We were helping neighbors prepare for a community event. The refrigerator suddenly stopped cooling properly, forcing us to rearrange our weekend plans. None of these situations were dramatic by themselves. Together, they quietly stole my attention. 3 days later, while making breakfast, I opened the banking app. My heart immediately sank. The payment was still waiting. Thankfully, the due date had not passed yet. But it was much closer than I had realized. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. I wasn't afraid because of the money. I was disappointed because I recognized something deeper. Old habits don't disappear just because we decide to become better. They wait patiently. Then they quietly return during our busiest moments. I paid the statement immediately. The entire process took less than 2 minutes. 2 minutes. That realization almost made me laugh. I had spent 3 days mentally carrying a task that required less time than brewing a cup of coffee. That evening, I told my husband exactly what had happened. Instead of criticizing me, he smiled. Can I ask you something? Of course. Was the problem really the payment? I thought carefully. No. What was it? I assumed I would remember. He nodded. Responsible people don't trust memory. They build systems. That sentence changed the way I organized almost every part of my life. Together, we created automatic reminders, calendar notifications, and recurring payment alerts. We even added a 15-minute Sunday evening routine to review our family finances before planning the upcoming week. None of these habits felt complicated. They simply removed unnecessary decisions. Research in behavioral psychology often shows that reducing friction makes positive habits easier to repeat. The fewer opportunities we give ourselves to forget, postpone, or procrastinate, the more consistent our behavior becomes. Suddenly, responsibility felt less like self-discipline and more like smart preparation. The next afternoon, while buying groceries, I naturally practiced another English phrase. Would you like a receipt? Yes, please. Anything else today? No, thank you. Simple conversations like these reminded me that fluency grows through repetition, not perfection. Responsibility worked exactly the same way. Small actions, repeated consistently, quietly transformed confidence. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Our Sunday evening routine became one of my favorite family traditions. Not because we enjoyed discussing bills. Because those conversations eliminated uncertainty. We laughed more. We worried less. We planned instead of reacting. One evening, while reviewing our monthly budget, my husband suddenly stopped talking. He looked at one section of the screen for much longer than usual, Emily, he said quietly. I think we've been measuring success the wrong way. I looked at him, confused. What do you mean? He slowly turned the laptop toward me. This number isn't the biggest improvement. I followed his finger. He wasn't pointing at our credit score. He was pointing at something completely different, something that revealed our marriage had changed far more than our finances ever had. And in that moment, I realized the greatest reward of responsibility could never be measured by any score. Love grew stronger through responsibility. The biggest improvement in our lives wasn't hiding inside our credit score. It was hiding inside our conversations. One evening, as my husband quietly turned the laptop toward me, I expected to celebrate a higher number. Instead, he pointed to something that couldn't be measured by any financial report. We hadn't argued about money in weeks. We had stopped blaming each other. We had started solving problems together. That was the moment I realized responsibility doesn't just build good credit, it builds stronger marriages. And once I saw that connection, I could never unsee it. I looked at my husband, still confused. What exactly are you showing me? I asked. He smiled. I'm showing you us. I laughed softly. There isn't a graph for that. There doesn't need to be. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. Think about the last month, he said. I did. Something had quietly changed inside our home. Instead of avoiding financial conversations, we welcomed them. Every Sunday evening, after the children finished their homework, we spent a few peaceful minutes reviewing our budget together. There were no raised voices. No guilt. No competition about who was right. If we made a mistake, we fixed it together. If we reached a goal, we celebrated together. The word "together" had become the most valuable part of every conversation. A few days later, while preparing dinner, I accidentally dropped a glass on the kitchen floor. It shattered into dozens of tiny pieces. My first reaction was frustration. I can't believe I did that. Before I could clean it up, my husband walked in. Instead of asking, "Who did this?" he asked, "Are you okay?" That simple difference stayed with me. Responsible relationships don't begin by finding someone to blame. They begin by protecting each other first. While cleaning the broken glass, we both laughed because the moment reminded us of our financial journey. Mistakes happen. What matters is how people respond afterward. The following afternoon, I stopped at a neighborhood cafe before picking up the children from school. The barista smiled and asked, "The usual today?" I smiled back. "Yes, please." Those 3 simple words made me realize how much my confidence had grown. Speaking English no longer felt like passing a test. It felt like participating in everyday American life. Just as responsibility became easier through repetition, communication became more natural through small daily conversations. That evening, my husband surprised me again. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old notebook we hadn't touched in years. Inside were our first family goals. Some pages made us laugh. One goal simply read, "Eat dinner together more often." Another said, "Spend less time worrying." Neither goal mentioned money. Neither goal mentioned credit. Yet somehow, becoming more responsible with our finances had helped us achieve both. Research in family psychology often suggests that couples who communicate openly about everyday responsibilities tend to experience lower financial stress and stronger long-term satisfaction. Looking around our kitchen that evening, I didn't need a research paper to believe it. I was living it. Then something unexpected happened. Our youngest child walked into the room carrying a school assignment. "Mom," he asked, "can you help me with one question?" "Of course." He pointed to the paper. "What does responsibility really mean?" I froze. A few months earlier, I would have answered with something simple like, doing your homework. Now the word meant so much more. I smiled and said, responsibility means doing the right thing even when nobody reminds you. He thought quietly for a moment. Then he looked at me and said something I will never forget. "So, you're teaching me responsibility every day without saying anything." I felt tears filling my eyes. Because he was right. Children don't only hear our advice. They watch our habits. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood alone in the quiet kitchen, thinking about everything that had changed. I believed responsibility had already transformed our marriage. I didn't yet realize it was quietly transforming our children too. And what happened during the following weekend proved that they had been watching far more closely than either my husband or I had ever imagined. My children were watching everything. I thought my children barely noticed our conversations about bills, budgets, and responsibility. I couldn't have been more wrong. One quiet Saturday morning, they showed me something so unexpected that I stood completely speechless in the middle of our kitchen. It wasn't a perfect report card or a trophy from school. It was something much smaller, and somehow much more powerful. In that moment, I realized children don't become who we tell them to be. They become who they quietly watch every single day. That discovery touched my heart more deeply than any improvement in my credit score ever could. Saturday mornings are usually my favorite time of the week. The house wakes up slowly. Pancakes fill the kitchen with their sweet smell, soft music plays in the background, and nobody rushes out the door. My husband was making coffee while I prepared breakfast, expecting another peaceful family morning. Then our oldest child walked into the kitchen carrying a small notebook. "Mom," he said, "I made something." I smiled. "What is it?" He handed me the notebook without saying another word. On the first page, I read the title. My responsibility list. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Inside were simple daily goals written in careful handwriting. Finish homework before playing games. Feed the dog every afternoon. Put dirty clothes in the laundry basket. Save part of my allowance. Read one English page before bed. The last goal made me smile. Every evening, I had spent just 10 minutes reading simple English stories aloud. I never asked my children to join me. Sometimes they listened. Sometimes they didn't. I assumed those quiet moments didn't matter very much. Apparently, they mattered more than I ever imagined. My son looked at me nervously. "Do you think it's a good list?" I hugged him. "I think it's a wonderful list." Then he said something that almost brought tears to my eyes. I wanted to make promises I could actually keep. Promises. There was that word again. The same idea my husband had tried to teach me weeks earlier. Responsibility wasn't about doing something extraordinary once. It was about keeping ordinary promises every single day. Later that afternoon, our family visited a nearby park. While the children played, my husband and I sat on a bench watching them laugh together. I think they're changing, I whispered. He smiled. No. I looked at him. We're changing. His answer stayed with me. Children often mirror what they experience at home. Developmental psychologists frequently explain that consistent routines help children develop self-control, confidence, and emotional security. Sitting there under the warm afternoon sun, I realized our small family habits were quietly becoming their foundation. Before heading home, we stopped for ice cream. The young cashier smiled warmly. Have a great weekend. You too, I answered naturally. Then my youngest repeated the same sentence with a big smile. You too. We all laughed. It was such a tiny English phrase, yet it reminded me how naturally learning happens when language becomes part of real life instead of pressure. Responsibility and English practice had quietly become part of our family's everyday rhythm. That evening, something unexpected happened again. While clearing the dinner table, my youngest noticed an empty cereal box. I'll recycle it, he said before anyone asked. Nobody had reminded him. Nobody had offered a reward. He simply saw something that needed to be done. I exchanged a quiet smile with my husband across the room. Without saying a word, we both understood the same thing. Children don't always remember long speeches. They remember everyday examples. Later that night, after everyone was asleep, I checked my banking app almost out of curiosity. My credit score hadn't changed much. Surprisingly, I wasn't disappointed. For the first time, I realized the number no longer controlled my emotions. Because another score mattered more. The invisible score my children were giving me every single day through their trust, their habits, and the example they chose to follow. Just before I put my phone away, a message from one of our neighbors appeared on the screen. It was an invitation to a neighborhood gathering. I thought it would be an ordinary social evening. I had no idea one conversation there would completely change my understanding of why responsibility is so deeply respected across America. Why responsibility matters in America. I expected an evening filled with casual conversations, backyard laughter, and homemade desserts. Instead, one unexpected question from a neighbor completely changed the way I understood American life. Nobody asked about my income. Nobody asked about my credit score. They asked something much more surprising. Can people count on you? That simple sentence stayed in my mind all night because I suddenly realized that in many parts of everyday life, responsibility speaks long before money ever does. I thought I understood the lesson already. I was only beginning to see how deeply it shaped the culture around me. Our neighborhood gathering took place on a warm Saturday evening. Children ran across green lawns while parents talked beside small tables covered with homemade food. Someone was grilling hamburgers. Someone else was sharing fresh lemonade. It felt relaxed, friendly, and wonderfully ordinary. As I carried a bowl of fruit salad toward the picnic table, our neighbor Sarah smiled and waved. "Emily. I'm glad you came." "Me too," I answered. We talked about school, gardening, weekend plans, and the unusually hot weather. Then another neighbor joined us. He mentioned that a local community organization was looking for volunteers to help organize a family event. Without thinking, I said, "That sounds interesting." He smiled. "We're always happy to welcome people we know we can depend on." The sentence sounded simple. But something inside me paused. Depend on. Those two words quietly echoed in my mind. Later, while helping clean the tables, I asked Sarah, "What makes someone dependable?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she handed me a stack of empty plates. "Watch." For the next 20 minutes, I noticed something fascinating. Nobody waited to be told what to do. One family folded chairs. Another collected trash. Teenagers carried coolers back to the community center. Parents checked the playground before leaving. Everyone simply noticed what needed to be done. No speeches. No applause. Just quiet responsibility. Sarah smiled. "That's what I mean." Driving home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. Responsibility wasn't treated as something extraordinary. It was simply expected. Not because people wanted recognition, but because everyone benefited when each person contributed a little. The next morning, while buying bread at a neighborhood bakery, I practiced another simple English conversation. "Good morning." "Good morning. How are you today?" "I'm doing well, thank you." "Anything special today?" "Just family breakfast." The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, yet it reminded me again that confidence grows through ordinary moments repeated many times. Learning English didn't require perfect grammar every minute. It required showing up consistently. Responsibility worked exactly the same way. That afternoon, I read an interesting psychology article explaining that trust grows through repeated reliable behavior rather than dramatic acts of kindness. People tend to predict future behavior based on consistent past actions. Suddenly, the connection became obvious. Credit scores reward consistency. Friendships reward consistency. Strong marriages reward consistency. Children trust consistency. Communities depend on consistency. The principle was surprisingly universal. That evening, I shared the article with my husband. He laughed softly. "So responsibility is like compound interest." I smiled. "How?" "The small things keep growing even when you stop noticing them." That comparison stayed with me. Days later, I experienced proof of it myself. Our neighbor Sarah knocked on our front door. "Emily," she asked, "would you mind keeping an eye on our house while we're away for a few days?" For a second, I simply stared at her. Out of all the neighbors on our street, she had chosen us. Not because of our credit score. Not because of our careers. Not because we were perfect. Because she trusted us. As I watched her walk back home, I realized something deeply emotional. Responsibility had quietly changed how other people saw our family long before I noticed the change myself. That evening, just before bedtime, I received an email that made my heart race. It wasn't from a bank. It wasn't about money. It was an opportunity our family had hoped for months to receive. And as I began reading the first sentence, I suddenly understood why every small responsible choice had been preparing us for this exact moment. My confidence began to grow. The email I opened that night wasn't offering free money, a prize, or a miracle. It offered something much more meaningful, proof that months of quiet responsibility had begun opening doors I never expected. As I read each line, I felt my hands trembling, not because I was afraid, but because I suddenly realized that the habits I once considered too small to matter had been changing my future all along. That was the moment I stopped asking, "Am I good enough?" and started asking a far better question: what other opportunities have been waiting for me to become ready? The email came from a local community organization where I had volunteered several times during the past few months. Most of my tasks had been simple. I helped organize family events, greeted visitors, served refreshments, and cleaned up after gatherings. None of those jobs felt important at the time. Apparently, someone had been paying attention. The message thanked me for being reliable and invited me to become a regular volunteer coordinator for future neighborhood activities. I read the invitation twice. Then a third time. My husband noticed my surprised expression. "What happened?" he asked. I handed him my phone. After reading the message, he smiled proudly. "I knew this was coming." "You did? You always show up." His answer sounded almost too simple. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was right. Responsibility doesn't always create immediate rewards. Sometimes it quietly builds a reputation before we even notice. The following weekend, I attended my first planning meeting. I expected to feel nervous, especially because the discussion was entirely in English. Instead, something unexpected happened. I understood far more than I expected. When someone asked for volunteers, I confidently replied, "I'd be happy to help." The words came naturally. Not because my English had suddenly become perfect. Because I had practiced small conversations every day, in grocery stores, coffee shops, neighborhood events, and family activities. Confidence hadn't appeared overnight. It had quietly grown through repetition. One participant smiled and said, "Thanks, Emily. We can always count on you." Those 6 words touched me more deeply than she probably realized. Weeks earlier, hearing English spoken that quickly would have made me anxious. Now, I wasn't just understanding it. I was becoming part of it. On the drive home, I reflected on everything that had changed. My confidence with English. My family routines. My relationship with my husband. Even my attitude toward money. They all shared one common foundation. Consistency. Psychologists often explain that confidence grows from evidence rather than positive thinking alone. Every time we successfully complete a small challenge, our brain collects proof that we are capable. Those repeated experiences slowly replace fear with trust. Looking back, I understood exactly what had happened. Every responsible action had become another piece of evidence. Every English conversation had become another small victory. Every promise I kept had quietly strengthened my belief in myself. A few days later, while buying groceries, the cashier greeted me with a familiar smile. "Good to see you again." "It's good to see you too," I replied. We chatted briefly about the weather before she handed me my receipt. As I walked toward the parking lot, I laughed softly. Months earlier, even conversations like this had felt intimidating. Now they felt enjoyable. That evening, after dinner, I checked my banking app again. This time, my credit score had improved. Only a little. Surprisingly, I smiled for a completely different reason. The number itself no longer excited me. It simply reflected habits I had already learned to value. The score wasn't changing me anymore. I had changed first. Just before putting my phone away, another notification appeared. This one wasn't from the bank. It was from my oldest child. He had left me a short handwritten note on the kitchen table. When I unfolded the paper and read the first sentence, I felt tears filling my eyes. It contained only a few simple words. But those words became the greatest reward my journey had given me, and they prepared me for one final lesson I never saw coming. The best reward wasn't my credit score. The greatest reward of my entire journey wasn't waiting inside my banking app. It wasn't a higher credit score, a better financial opportunity, or even the compliment I received from my neighbors. It arrived as a handwritten note left quietly on our kitchen table by my oldest child. I almost walked past it without noticing. Looking back now, I'm grateful I didn't. Those few simple words became the most valuable gift I have ever received because they proved something I never expected. Responsibility had changed far more than my finances. It had changed the people I love most. The note was folded neatly beside my morning coffee mug. On the front, my son had written only one sentence. "For Mom." I smiled before opening it. Inside, in his careful handwriting, I read, "Mom, thank you for always keeping your promises." I sat down without saying a word. The kitchen was completely quiet. Outside the window, I could hear birds singing, but inside the house everything seemed to pause for a moment. I read the sentence again. Then one more time. There was nothing about credit scores. Nothing about money. Nothing about bills. Only one idea. Keeping promises. When my husband walked into the kitchen, he immediately noticed the tears in my eyes. What happened? I handed him the note. He read it slowly before looking back at me with a gentle smile. "I think that's worth more than any perfect credit score." I nodded because I couldn't speak. He was absolutely right. For months, I had believed I was learning how financial responsibility worked in America. Now I understood something much deeper. Responsibility is never really about numbers. Numbers simply reveal habits. And habits quietly shape families. Later that afternoon, our family visited a local farmer's market. We wandered between fresh fruit stands, homemade bread, flowers, and small local businesses. It was one of those peaceful American weekends that remind you how much joy can be found in ordinary moments. At one small bakery, the cashier recognized us. "Good morning, Emily." "Good morning," I answered happily. "The usual cinnamon bread?" "Yes, please." As we chatted for a minute, I realized how naturally English conversations had become part of my everyday life. I wasn't translating every sentence anymore. I was simply communicating. Just like responsibility, language grows stronger through consistent practice instead of dramatic effort. While walking home, my husband asked me an interesting question. If you could go back 6 months, what advice would you give yourself? I thought carefully. Then I smiled. I'd stop chasing perfect results. What would you chase instead? Reliable habits. He laughed. I think you've finally figured it out. Research in behavioral science often shows that lasting change happens when people focus on identity instead of outcomes. Instead of saying, "I want a better score," successful people begin saying, "I want to become someone who acts responsibly." Looking back, I realized that was exactly what had happened to me. I wasn't simply improving my finances. I was becoming a different person. That evening, our family gathered around the dinner table as usual. Everyone shared one good thing that had happened during the week. When it was my turn, I held up my son's note. This was my favorite moment. Nobody said anything for several seconds. Then my youngest smiled and quietly added, "I want people to trust me like they trust Mom." My heart melted. In that instant, every late payment reminder, every budgeting conversation, every small English practice session, every responsible decision suddenly felt worthwhile. The invisible rewards had become visible. Later that night, before going to bed, I checked my banking app one more time. My score had improved again. I smiled and closed the app almost immediately. For the first time, it wasn't the most important thing I looked at that day. Because I already knew the score that mattered most couldn't be measured by any bank. The next morning, however, one final conversation with a complete stranger would give me the answer to the question that had started this entire journey. Why do responsibility and trust matter so much in America? The answer changed the ending of my story forever. Responsibility changed my life forever. The answer to the question that changed my life didn't come from a financial expert, a banker, or a perfect credit report. It came from a complete stranger while I was standing in line for a cup of coffee on an ordinary Monday morning. One short conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it explained why responsibility matters so deeply in American life. As I walked away that day, I realized my credit score had never been the hero of this story. Responsibility was. And once I truly understood that, I stopped trying to build a better score and started building a better life. The coffee shop was busy, filled with people beginning another work week. While waiting in line, I noticed the woman in front of me smiling at everyone she met. When she turned around, she complimented my reusable shopping bag. "I like your bag," she said. "Thank you," I replied with a smile. We started chatting naturally about the weather, weekend family activities, and our favorite local bakery. Before long, she mentioned that she worked as a financial coach for families in our community. I laughed softly. "What a coincidence," I said. "I've spent months learning more about credit scores than I ever expected." She smiled knowingly. Then you've probably discovered they're really about habits. I think so, I answered. But I still feel like I'm missing one piece. She paused for a moment before speaking. The score is only the shadow, she said. The real person is standing in the sunlight. I looked at her, puzzled. She continued. Your habits create your character. Your character creates trust. And trust quietly opens doors long before you ever notice them. Those words stayed with me long after we said goodbye. Driving home, I reflected on the past several months. The dropped credit score. The late payment reminder. The Sunday family meetings. The English conversations at grocery stores and coffee shops. The notebook my son created. The handwritten letter that brought tears to my eyes. The trust of our neighbors. None of those moments had happened by accident. Each one had grown from hundreds of small responsible decisions. That evening, our family gathered around the dinner table, just as we always did. The children laughed while telling funny stories from school. My husband poured everyone a glass of water before looking at me with a quiet smile. You've changed, he said. I smiled back. I know. But not because your score improved. No. Because you don't worry about proving yourself anymore. He was right. For the first time in a long time, I felt peaceful. Psychologists often explain that lasting confidence develops when our actions consistently match our values. Instead of searching for external approval, we begin trusting ourselves because we repeatedly keep promises to ourselves. Looking back, I realized that responsibility had done far more than improve my financial habits. It had strengthened my marriage. It had influenced my children. It had improved my English through simple daily conversations. It had made me calmer, more organized, and more grateful for ordinary days. The following morning, while paying for groceries, the cashier smiled as she handed me my receipt. Have a wonderful day. You too, I answered naturally. As I walked toward the parking lot, I realized those 3 words represented much more than an English phrase. They represented confidence. Not perfect English. Not perfect finances. Simply confidence built one ordinary conversation at a time. Before going to bed that night, I opened my banking app one final time. My credit score had improved again. I smiled warmly. Then locked my phone without checking anything else. Months earlier, that number would have controlled my emotions. Now it simply reminded me of something much more valuable. Responsibility matters because it quietly shapes every part of life that truly matters. Our family, our relationships, our reputation, our opportunities, and even the way we believe in ourselves. If my story helps you remember one thing, let it be this. Great lives are rarely built by one extraordinary decision. They are built by ordinary promises, kept every single day. That's all for today. I'll create many more stories like this in the future. Please subscribe so you don't miss the next one.